Aloha and welcome to Module 7, Session 2, Blues and Gospel, Twin Trunks of the Contemporary Music Tree. Now when we talk about the trunks of the tree, like we talked about last session, we talk about main parts of the tree that other kinds of genres and styles came out of. And when we talked about blues, we were talking about the secular trunk of this tree. And today, in talking about gospel, we'll talk about the sacred part of that tree. There's an online article for you to read, and then we can discuss some of the things that are in that article. So take a look at that. There was one paragraph in particular that I want to discuss with you. To those who still hold on to the presupposition that there's a difference in the sound of sacred versus secular music, I would ask this question. Is there a different vocabulary that you use to describe your everyday life from your faith? Are some words holier than others? Words are neither secular nor sacred. It's all about the intent behind the words. Now, I have to say that there are limitations to this comparison because there are some words that are not necessarily sacred, but on the other side of the coin, there are some words that are profane or vulgar. So this linguistic comparison breaks down just a little bit. Now, for LDS views, Latter-day Saints, the church that sponsors our university and the church that some of you might belong to, when we adapt this language analogy, we must think that not only is vocabulary and its intent important to consider, but also tone of voice in a metaphorical kind of way must be considered. So a certain serene tone of voice is recommended for formal worship in this church, while a more energetic tone of voice, so to speak, can be employed for more informal religious occasions, and still more energetic tone of voice for personal inspirational listening. Some further ideas about the divisions between sacred and secular. The article says, Christians have always seemed to have an uneasy time with percussion and rhythm, but rhythm is nothing more than mathematics. Are some numbers more holy than other numbers? How ridiculous is that? The body was constructed by God to enjoy the feeling of rhythm. The heart beats in rhythm. The universe pulsates and moves in rhythm. The 7-day cycle of activity and rest is all about rhythm. The more rhythm you feel in your body, the more alive you are. To not feel rhythm is to be dead. Now again, this paragraph is talking about bodily responses and rhythm and mathematics, but the LDS view, just so you're aware of it, is that rhythm should be subdued and simple in formal worship context, in order to let intellectual and emotional responses supersede bodily responses. In other words, in a formal worship context, like our sacrament meetings, we are not going for a bodily response, a physical response. We want it to be spiritual, emotional, intellectual. In non-worship contexts, a balance of intellectual, emotional, and bodily responses is desirable. And I think the key word there is balance. So the bottom line for our discussion in this session is that for most people, musical elements themselves are not restricted to either sacred or secular usage. Intent is the main consideration. So when we consider some music today, in the gospel side of things, the intent is sacred professions of faith, professions of belief. And on the secular side of things, you certainly can have inspirational messages. I'm thinking of R. Kelly's I Believe I Can Fly, for example. But it doesn't have the same intent to glorify God, to glorify a Christian God or Christian religion. So with that in mind, let's talk about intent in 20th century African American music. We've talked about blues in the previous session. If you recall, blues and its intent are to communicate frankly about interpersonal relationships, especially romantic or sexual ones, and to serve as an emotional catharsis concerning life's challenges, be they financial, social, political, or to talk about needs and wants in real life. Gospel and its intent, on the other hand, are to glorify God, to focus a participant and the listener on spiritual things, to integrate the emotional and the spiritual, and to convey spiritual truths. And I should mention here, we see photos, Ray Charles in the upper left-hand corner of the slide, who was well known for bringing gospel style into early R&B and rock. And down at the bottom right, we have Aretha Franklin, known in the U.S. as the Queen of Soul, had many secular music hits starting in the 60s. But she also sang gospel, and this is an album cover from one of her early gospel albums called Gospel Greats. Let's take a look at a video now to just remind ourselves of how this intent is relayed in the blues.
Sitting around, me and my man. I tell you that I don't want nobody, no, no. Always sitting right there, just looking at me and that man. Being my mother, my brother, my father, or my sister. Would you believe I get up, put on some clothes, go out, and help him find somebody for themselves if I can? Yes, I will. Now I don't mind company, because company's all right with me. Every once in a while. Don't get me wrong, I don't mind company, because company's all right with me. Every once in a while. But me and that man get to love. Hey girl, I dig it, but I don't have time to sit with you and just sit back and sit and smile. Now don't send me no doctor, filling me up with all of those pills. I got me a man named Dr. Feelgood. It's really this man's game. And after one visit to Dr. Feelgood, you understand why Feelgood is his name. Oh, yeah. Oh, a man sure makes me feel real good.
So there in that video we had Aretha Franklin back in 1968 singing the blues as a slow 12-bar blues, singing about her man who she nicknames Dr. Feelgood because that's how he makes her feel. And it has a secular intent. It has romantic notions in there. It's talking about a romantic relationship. Now we'll watch Aretha Franklin later on in her career singing a gospel song made famous by Thomas A. Dorsey, and we'll learn a little bit more about him in a later slide in this presentation.
In the memory of my father, Reverend C.L. Franklin, and Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, I'd like to sing one of his favorites, a song that he'd always request, a song with long, strong arms that rocked him in the cradle of ages. Precious Lord, take my hand, lead me on. Lord, let me, Lord, let me stand. Yeah, so tired. Lord, I get weak. And Let's stop. Oh, take my hand. Yeah, precious.
I need to tell you that I grew up listening to Aretha Franklin. And for a small town boy in Pennsylvania to hear that amazing voice was very transformative for me. Began a lifelong appreciation for African American musical styles. When she sings Precious Lord, Take My Hand, the emotion behind it is very evident. And of course, as you saw in the video, it was recorded in 1984, 16 years after she recorded Dr. Feelgood, and conveys that power in a spiritual sense. The intent is sacred. Now this brings us to a concept called code switching. And I can give you an example of that happens here on campus all the time. And I'm going to use as my example a BYU Hawaii student from Taiwan. So she's walking down the hallways here at BYU, talking to her friends in Mandarin Chinese. She walks into my classroom and begins speaking English. She is code switching from her native language to another language that she has learned. And this happens musically as well, and especially important when we consider blues and gospel, the sacred and the secular. Musically speaking, we could say that blues and jazz musicians began bringing their musical codes, or their musical language, into church music in the 1920s and 1930s. So they began code switching in a musical sense, even when the intent was sacred. So gospel then absorbed that language and developed its own dialect, so to speak. So to use these linguistic analogies, gospel music became a dialect of blues and jazz and church music combined together in a syncretic way. Now that gospel dialect, after it was formulated, has influenced secular African American music ever since that time in the 1930s. So the style of singing, the vocal textures, the song forms, the use of organ, there are a lot of things that came from that gospel syncretic form and then further syncretized, further hybridized secular music styles from that time on. So I want to give you a few examples of secular artists who absorbed gospel influences. And in a lot of cases, these artists grew up and had their first musical experiences in the church. So we have some contemporary artists that are popping up here on the screen. We have Alicia Keys, Mariah Carey, Whitney Houston, Toni Braxton, Brian McKnight, Lauryn Hill. All had their musical beginnings in the church and still are heavily influenced by gospel musical style and gospel sensibilities.